The air in the Mercy General Emergency Department was a carefully layered thing. At the bottom, the persistent and sharp scent of antiseptic cleaner that never quite conquered the ghost of yesterday's suffering. Above it floated the burnt, acidic smell of stale coffee from the break room pot, a testament to 12-hour shifts fueled by caffeine and sheer will. And woven through it all, the subtlest notes, the faint, metallic tang of fear sweating from a patient's skin, the sweet decay of a diabetic ulcer, the sterile perfume of latex gloves snapping onto wrists. For Alara Vance, it was a symphony of controlled chaos, a pale imitation of a world she had fought desperately to leave behind. She stood by the supply closet, her movements deliberately slow, almost clumsy. Her shoulders were stooped in the cheap, scratchy blue scrubs, a posture of apology that she had perfected over the last 6 months. She was counting gauze pads, her fingers, thick with calluses at the knuckles, and laced with a web of faint white scars, fumbling the sterile paper packets. She dropped one. It fluttered to the linoleum floor with a soft hiss. Vance, for crying out loud, can you even count to 10 without an abacus? The voice was a whip crack across the relative quiet of the nurse's station. Dr. Eris Thorne, head of emergency medicine, stood with his arms crossed, his tailored Italian suit a stark, arrogant contrast to the functional uniforms of his staff. His shoes shone with a blinding polish, and his cologne, a sharp, citrusy scent, was an invasion. He did not wear scrubs. He considered them beneath him, a garment for the workers, not the thinkers. Alara bent to retrieve the fallen packet, her body moving with a practiced hesitancy. Inside her mind, the tactical computer that had kept her alive for a decade in the dust-choked hells of. The world flickered to life. Threat assessment, Eris Thorne. Proximity, 6 meters. Posture, aggressive, dominant. Tone, condescending. Threat level, negligible. Annoyance level, critical. She suppressed the analysis as quickly as it arose. That part of her was supposed to be dormant, locked away in a steel box at the bottom of her soul. Sorry, doctor, she mumbled, her voice flat and soft, barely audible over the relentless, rhythmic beeping of a nearby heart monitor. Just finish the inventory and try not to contaminate the entire supply chain while you're at it, he sneered, turning his attention to a younger nurse, Ben Carter, who flinched at the doctor's abrasive tone. Carter! I need a differential diagnosis on the chest pain in bed 4. Don't just stand there gawking at incompetence. Alara watched him stride away, his polished shoes squeaking on the clean floor. She took a slow, measured breath, the kind she had practiced in the screaming belly of a Black Hawk helicopter descending into a hot landing zone. In through the nose for 4, hold for 4, out through the mouth for 4. The rage, a cold, familiar predator, uncoiled in her gut. She forced it back down. This was penance. This was peace. The humiliation was the price of anonymity, a shield against the boasts that haunted her sleep. The ghosts of men she had saved and men she had not. Her internal world was a landscape of memory and analysis, a stark contrast to the placid, slightly confused mask she presented. As she stacked the gauze, her mind overlaid the sterile white room with the sun-baked mud walls of a compound. In Kandahar, the smell of antiseptic was replaced by the coppery stench of blood and the acrid smoke of a spent grenade. The beeping monitor became the frantic, high-pitched scream of a wounded soldier, his life pouring out into the unforgiving sand. She could feel the rough texture of a pressure bandage under her palms, the slick heat of blood soaking through her gloves, the grit of dust between her teeth. She blinked and it was gone. She was just a nurse in a clean hospital, counting gauze. She was safe. She was anonymous. She was nobody. And that was all she wanted to be. Later she was assigned to bed 7, a curtained-off cubicle holding 2 young men, both with fresh plaster casts on their legs and an attitude that filled the small space. They were soldiers, Marines by the high and tight haircuts, and the easy, profane banter they shared. They couldn't have been older than 22. They looked at her with the bored, dismissive eyes of young men who felt invincible, even when laid low by a stateside motorcycle accident. Hey, nurse, the one in the right bed, Corporal Davies, called out as she checked his IV drip. You ever stick one of those things in someone before? You look a little shaky. His friend, Corporal Miller, snickered. Take it easy on her, Davo. She's probably new. Probably faints at the sight of blood. Alara's hands, which had once performed a field cricothyrotomy with a pocket knife and the ink tube from a pen during a firefight, fumbled with the plastic dial on the IV line, a deliberate, practiced fumble. I'll be careful, she said, her voice quiet. Internal assessment. Subjects are post-op, stable. Vitals within normal parameters. Psychological state, bored. Exhibiting mild bravado as a coping mechanism for temporary incapacitation. Common among young infantry. She cataloged the information, filed it away. Her external self simply offered a small, hesitant smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes were flat, the color of a winter sky over a frozen lake, and they gave nothing away. "Yeah, you do that," Davy said, winking at Miller. "Wouldn't want you to miss the vein and have to turn me into a pincushion. Not with these good looks on the line." Alara finished her check, her movements economical despite their feigned slowness. She rolled on the balls of her feet, a habit from years of moving silently over broken ground, a predator's gait that went unnoticed by the casual observer. She adjusted the corporal's pillow. Her hands were gentle, but the strength in them was coiled and absolute. She could feel the powerful muscles in his neck, the carotid artery pulsing steadily beneath his skin. She knew 3 ways to sever it with a thumb. The thought was unwelcome, an intruder from her past life. She withdrew her hand as if burned. "Is your pain level manageable, Corporal?" she asked. The question a standard part of her script. "It's fine, Florence Nightingale. Just bored," Miller chimed in. "Hey, you were in the service?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She froze for a fraction of a second, the mask almost slipping. Her heart rate, usually a steady 60 beats per minute, kicked up to 65. "Control." "No," she said. The lie was smooth from practice. "Never." "Huh." Davies grunted, looking her over. "You just have that look, like you've seen things." Alara's mind flashed to the Koringal Valley, the Valley of Death, the relentless crack of sniper fire, the roar of an Apache overhead, the face of a young private, his eyes wide with shock as he stared at the ruin of his own chest. She had held his hand as the light left them. She had seen things. "I just have a boring face," she replied, her voice empty of emotion. She turned and pulled the curtain shut, leaving them to their banter. The wall inside her mind, the one she had painstakingly built brick by bloody brick, felt a little thinner today. Dr. Thorne cornered her near the medication dispensary an hour later. He held up a chart, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on her handwritten notes. His presence was a physical pressure, a localized weather system of arrogance and disdain. "Vance," he began, his voice low but carrying, designed to be overheard by the nearby staff. "Explain this entry. Patient reports subjective feeling of unease. What is that? Are you a nurse or a psychic? I need objective data. Numbers. Facts. Not your vague, womanly intuitions." Ben Carter, the young nurse from before, was nearby, pretending to organize a tray of vials. He studiously avoided looking in their direction, but Alara could feel his discomfort. She knew Thorne's tactics. He never corrected in private if a public humiliation was an option. It's solidified his kingdom of controlled chaos. "The patient in bed 11, Alara explained, keeping her eyes fixed on a point just over his shoulder. "His vitals are stable, but his skin is clammy, and his color is off. He said he felt like something bad was about to happen. I thought it was worth noting." Thorne let out a short, derisive laugh. "You thought it was worth noting. Astounding. You're not paid to think, Vance. You're paid to follow my orders and chart vital signs. Is his O2 saturation dropping? Is his blood pressure tanking? No? Then your feelings are irrelevant. Now, rewrite this note with actual medical data, or don't write anything at all. Am I clear?" "Yes, doctor," she said. The words were ash in her mouth. She had once made life-or-death decisions based on the subtlest signs. The smell of a wound, the flicker in a soldier's eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in the rhythm of a firefight. That feeling of unease was data, hard-won from 1,000 brutal lessons. It was the predator's sense that the wind had changed. In her old life, ignoring it got people killed. Here, it got her reprimanded. She took the chart from him, their fingers brushing. His skin was soft, manicured. Hers was rough, scarred. He recoiled slightly, as if from something unclean. "And Vance," he added, leaning in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was more insulting than his shouting. "I saw you talking with the Marines in bed 7. Don't get any ideas. You're a nurse, not one of them. You push fluids and empty bedpans. They kick indoors. Try to remember the difference." He walked away, leaving her standing in the sterile hallway, the plastic chart clutched in her hand. The plastic creaked under the sudden, unconscious pressure of her grip. For a fleeting moment, she let herself remember the weight of a rifle in her hands, the satisfyingly solid clack of a magazine seating home. It was a memory of power, of purpose, of a time when her skills were valued above all else. A time when men like Eris Thorne, with their soft hands and loud voices, would have been nothing more than a liability to be protected or discarded. She took another slow, cleansing breath. The anger receded. The wall was rebuilt. She was Nurse Vance. She emptied bedpans. She was nobody. She turned and walked back toward bed 11, her rubber soles squeaking softly on the polished floor, the sound of her quiet, self-imposed prison. The next day, Thorne's petty tyranny escalated. He found her restocking the trauma bays, a task she performed with quiet efficiency, the muscle memory of preparing a medkit under fire, making the process automatic. He watched her for a moment, a frown creasing his brow, as if her competence in this simple task was a personal affront. "Vance," he announced, his voice echoing slightly in the large, tiled room. "I have a new assignment for you. The South Wing storage closet, Level B, needs a full inventory and deep clean. It hasn't been done in a year. I want every bottle counted, every surface scrubbed. That should be simple enough for you to handle without any feelings." The other nurses nearby fell silent. The Level B storage closet was a dungeon, a forgotten room filled with expired supplies, broken equipment, and a thick layer of dust. It was janitor's work, a punishment assignment designed for maximum humiliation. It was his way of putting her back in her box. "Understood, Doctor," Alara said, her face a blank mask. She placed the last chest tube kit on its shelf and turned to face him. Her gaze was steady, but inside, a wire pulled taut. The pressure in her skull was immense. She felt the ghosts stirring, whispering at the edges of her consciousness. They whispered of injustice, of pride, of violence. She spent the next 3 hours in the dim, musty-smelling closet. The only light came from a single, buzzing fluorescent bulb that cast long, dancing shadows. As she wiped down dusty shelves and cataloged expired saline bags, the isolation began to work on her. The wall, her carefully constructed mental fortress, began to show cracks. A memory, sharp and unwanted, broke through. She was in Fallujah. The air was thick with cordite and pulverized concrete. She was in a makeshift aid station in the shell of a bombed-out building, working on a young Marine who had taken shrapnel to the gut. His name was Casey. He had a picture of his high school girlfriend taped to the inside of his helmet. He was bleeding out faster than she could push fluids into him. His commander, a young, arrogant lieutenant who was panicked and out of his depth, was screaming at her to move him, to fall back to a more secure position. "We leave now, medic," the lieutenant had yelled, his voice cracking with fear. "He'll die if we move him, sir," she had yelled back, her hands deep in the boy's abdomen, trying to manually clamp a bleeding artery. "I need 2 more minutes. That is an order. Now." She had looked from the dying boy to the terrified officer, and she had made a choice. She had ignored the order. She had stayed. Casey had died in her arms 60 seconds later. The lieutenant wrote her up for insubordination. He had needed someone to blame for his own failure of command, for his own fear. He was Eris Thorne in a different uniform. Alara's hand, holding a dusty rag, clenched into a fist. Her knuckles went white. The cheap cotton fabric ripped with a soft tearing sound. The pressure of that memory, of that injustice, was a physical weight. She wanted a quiet life. She had earned a quiet life. But the price was this daily, grinding humiliation, this constant reminder of a world where arrogant men held power and competence was punished. The breaking point, a cliff edge she had been walking along for months, suddenly felt terrifyingly close. She closed her eyes, forcing the image of Casey's face from her mind. Breathe. Just breathe. It was then that the world changed. A series of sharp, piercing alarms blared through the hospital's intercom system, a sound that cut through the mundane hum of the building like a scream. Then came the overhead announcement, a woman's voice, tight with controlled panic. "Code Black. Mass casualty incident. All available staff report to the emergency department immediately. Code Black." The sound hit Alara like a physical shock. For a moment, she was frozen in the dusty closet. Code Black. The words were a key, unlocking the steel box in her soul. The ghosts, the memories, the skills she had suppressed for so long didn't just stir. They erupted. The heavy, suffocating pressure that had been her constant companion for months evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, cold clarity. The buzzing fluorescent light overhead no longer seemed dim. It was sharp, analytical. The distant shouts and running footsteps weren't chaos. They were data points, mapping on the flow of personnel. Her heart rate, which had spiked with the memory of Fallujah, dropped instantly to a steady, powerful rhythm. The clumsy, hesitant Nurse Vance dissolved like smoke. In her place stood someone else. Someone older, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. She dropped the torn rag and moved. Her posture snapped ramrod straight, her shoulders squared. She left the closet, not walking, but flowing through the hallway, her feet rolling from heel to toe, a silent, fluid gait that devoured the distance. The staff running past her were a frantic, panicked herd. She moved through them like a shark through a school of fish, untouched and untouchable. When she entered the emergency department, it was a vision of hell. The kingdom of controlled chaos had devolved into pure anarchy. Gurneys were everywhere, bearing the broken and bleeding victims of what looked like a multi-vehicle pileup. The air was thick with the smell of blood and burnt chemicals. Nurses were shouting, patients were screaming, and in the center of it all stood Dr. Eris Thorne. He was failing. His face was pale, his eyes wide with panic. His hands trembled visibly as he held a pair of trauma shears. He was shouting orders, but they were superficial and contradictory. "Get me a CBC on him. Someone intubate her. Where are the O-neg reserves?" He was a man playing the part of a commander, but the sounds of real battle had broken him. He was the lieutenant from Fallujah, all over again. Alara's gaze swept the room, a machine-like assessment that took less than 3 seconds. She triaged a dozen patients with her eyes alone. The man with the sucking chest wound. The woman with the obvious femoral artery bleed. The quiet one in the corner, the one everyone was ignoring, who was rapidly going into shock. Her mind was a tactical computer, processing variables, calculating probabilities, and assigning priorities with ruthless efficiency. The chaos wasn't overwhelming. It was a problem with a series of solutions. She saw Ben Carter trying to start an IV on a man whose arm was slick with blood, his young face a mask of desperation. She saw an older nurse simply frozen, staring at the carnage, unable to process the scale of the disaster, and she saw Thorne standing over Corporal Davies from Bed 7, who had been moved onto a gurney to make room. A piece of twisted metal, shrapnel from the crash, was embedded deep in his thigh, just inches from his femoral artery. Thorne was grabbing it, preparing to pull it out. It was a fatal mistake, a rookie error. Pulling out an impaled object without knowing what vessels it was tamponating was a death sentence. Davies would bleed out in minutes. This was the critical moment, the point of no return. Her core duty, the one burned into her from years of patching up broken soldiers, primum non, no sir, first do no harm, overrode her mission to remain hidden. The life of the boy in front of her was more important than her peace. She moved. She crossed the 10 feet separating them in 4 silent strides. She didn't shout. She didn't ask. "Let go," she said. Her voice was unrecognizable. It was not the soft, hesitant mumble of Nurse Vance. It was a low, resonant command, a tone that carried the absolute weight of authority earned in blood and fire. Thorne looked up, startled, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. "Vance? Get out of my way. I'm trying to save this man's life." "No," she said, her voice dropping even lower, colder. "You are about to kill him." She didn't wait for him to respond. Her right hand shot out and clamped around his wrist. Her grip was like iron. Thorne cried out in surprise and pain. With a single economical twist, she forced his hand open, making him drop the metal shard. With her other hand, she snatched a roll of gauze and a hemostat from a nearby tray. "Move," she commanded. It wasn't a request. She pushed him. Not a gentle shove, but a hard, deliberate displacement, forcing him to stumble back a step, breaking his contact with the patient. The physical act was a declaration of war. In that moment, the mask of the quiet, clumsy subordinate did not just slip. It shattered into a million pieces. The transformation was absolute. Her stooped posture was gone, replaced by a spine of steel. Her gaze, once downcast and avoidant, was now hard, analytical, and utterly focused. It was the gaze of a predator that had just identified its prey. The very atmosphere around her seemed to change, to cool, to focus into a point of lethal competence. Corporal Davies, pale and sweating, stared up at her. His eyes widened. He saw the change. "Holy!" he whispered. Thorne, sputtering with rage and shock, found his voice. "What do you think you're doing? You're fired, Vance. You are relieved of duty. Security." Alara ignored him completely. He was just noise now. Static on the line. He was irrelevant. She turned to the patient, her hands already working with impossible speed and precision. "Corporal," she said, her new voice calm and clear over the din. "My name is Alara. I'm going to help you. Do not move." She packed gauze tightly around the base of the metal object, stabilizing it. Her fingers moved with a surgeon's grace. A demolition expert's certainty. There was no hesitation. Every movement had a purpose. "Carter!" she barked, not looking up. Ben Carter, who had been staring, frozen in awe and confusion, jumped as if zapped with a cattle prod. "Yes, Get me 2 units of ONEG, a full trauma panel, and a vascular surgery kit. And get Dr. Ramirez down here. Tell her we have a probable femoral transection. Go, now." Ben didn't even glance at Thorne. He saw the truth. He saw the calm in the storm, the one person who knew exactly what to do. He dropped what he was doing and ran to obey. He was her first follower. The chain of command had been broken and reforged in an instant, not around a title, but around sheer, undeniable competence. Thorne, his face turning a blotchy red, stepped forward again. "I am in charge here. You will all listen to me." I said, "She is." Alara looked up from her work, her eyes meeting his for a fraction of a second. The dead, flat gaze of the woman who had seen the abyss and had not blinked. It stopped him cold. "You are relieved, Doctor," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the finality of a judge's sentence. "You are a liability. Go stand in a corner and try not to kill anyone else." She turned back to her patient, dismissing him as completely as one would dismiss a fly. The public humiliation was absolute. Dr. Eris Thorne, head of the department, had been stripped of his authority, his relevance, and his dignity in front of his entire staff by the clumsy nurse he had been tormenting for months. He stood there, sputtering, impotent, as the ER began to reorganize itself not around his panicked shouts, but around the calm, precise commands of Alara Vance. The next hour was a masterclass in organized violence and trauma medicine. Alara became the still center of the hurricane, a conductor orchestrating a symphony of crisis. Her commands were short, sharp, and brutally efficient. Green tag, move to the hallway. Yellow tag, Bay 2. Red tags, here, now. I need a chest tube, 28 French, right here. Someone get me a pleurovac. That's an arterial bleed. Pressure isn't working. Turn a key. High and tight. Write the time on his forehead. She moved from patient to patient, a blur of motion and focused intent. On a woman gasping for breath, her face turning blue, Alara didn't wait for an anesthesiologist. She grabbed a scalpel and an ET tube. Tracheal deviation, no breath sounds on the left. Tension pneumothorax. Without a moment's hesitation, she performed a needle decompression, plunging a large bore needle into the woman's chest. There was a hiss of escaping air, and the woman's color began to return. It was a textbook procedure performed with the speed and confidence of someone who had done it 100 times, in the dark, under fire, with dirt in her teeth. She reached the man with the sucking chest wound. "Get me a vented seal. Don't have one? Give me that saline bag wrapper and tape." With a few deft movements, she had fashioned a makeshift occlusive dressing, taping it on 3 sides to create a flutter valve. It was a field improvisation, a trick from a forgotten war, but it worked perfectly. The staff, who had been panicked and disorganized moments before, fell into a new rhythm, her rhythm. They responded to her commands instantly, their fear replaced by a focused sense of purpose. They recognized true command when they saw it. It wasn't loud. It wasn't arrogant. It was calm. It was certain, and it saved lives. Ben Carter became her shadow, her de facto second in command. He anticipated her needs, fetching supplies, relaying her orders, his face a mixture of terror and profound respect. He had never seen anything like it. This woman, this quiet, fumbling nurse, was a force of nature. She came to a young man, barely a teenager, whose leg was mangled, bleeding profusely from a severed artery. His blood pressure was crashing. The nurse holding pressure was panicked, her hands slipping in the blood. "It's not working!" the nurse cried. "We're losing him." Alara was there in an instant. She pushed the nurse aside gently. "Let me." She put one hand on top of the other, found the pressure point in his groin, and leaned in with her entire body weight, her arm locked straight. It was a brutal, physically demanding maneuver designed to manually occlude the femoral artery against the pelvic bone. Her face was a mask of concentration. The bleeding slowed to a trickle. "Hold him," she grunted to Ben. "Don't let me slip." She looked at the boy's pale, waxy face. His pupils were blown. He was circling the drain. "We need blood in him now. Where's that ONEG?" "They're bringing it," Ben said. "Not fast enough," Alara stated. Her eyes darted around, landing on an intraosseous drill kit. "Give me that." Without waiting for consent, she took the drill, aimed it at the flat part of the boy's tibia, just below the knee, and pulled the trigger. The high-pitched whine of the drill was followed by a soft pop as it punched through the cortex of the bone. In seconds, she had secured a line directly into his bone marrow, a direct route to his vascular system when his veins had all collapsed. It was an aggressive, high-stakes procedure, one many doctors in the hospital were not certified to perform. Alara did it as easily as tying her shoes. She hooked up the bag of blood and squeezed it, forcing the life-saving fluid into the boy's body. Slowly, miraculously, the color started to return to his cheeks. Through it all, Dr. Thorne stood on the periphery, a ghost in his own department. He tried to interject a few times, to reassert his authority, but no one listened. They moved around him as if he were a piece of furniture. His shouts were lost in the focused, efficient hum of the team that Alara had built in minutes. His irrelevance was total. He was witnessing his own deposition, and the utter terrifying competence of the woman who had replaced him. 2 hours later, the chaos had subsided. The last of the critical patients had been stabilized and sent to surgery or the ICU. The ER was a wreck, littered with bloody rags, discarded packaging, and the detritus of dozens of frantic medical interventions. But it was quiet. The air, thick with the smell of blood and fear, was also filled with a new palpable sense of awe. The staff moved slowly, cleaning, restocking, their movements weary but their faces holding a shared look of reverence. They kept glancing at Alara. She stood near the nurse's station, wiping blood from her forearms with a rough paper towel. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the familiar, bone-deep exhaustion. The mask of Nurse Vance was gone, and she was too tired to rebuild it. What was left was just her, calm, quiet, and radiating an authority that needed no title. Corporal Davies, stabilized and waiting for the elevator to take him to the OR, caught her eye from his gurney. He lifted a weak hand and gave her a slow, formal salute. "Mom," he said, his voice hoarse. "I don't know who you are, but thank you." Alara simply nodded. "Pain level, Corporal?" she asked, her voice returning to its quiet, flat cadence. But now it was imbued with an unstated power. It wasn't meekness, it was control. That was when Eris Thorne decided to make his final fatal move. He strode out of his office, his face a thunderous mask of fury. He had found his courage now that the danger was past. He pointed a trembling finger at Alara. "Vance, my office!" "Now," he bellowed, his voice unnaturally loud in the now quiet room. "You are finished. Your career in medicine is over. You will be brought up on charges of insubordination, assault, and reckless endangerment." Alara looked at him, her expression unreadable. She dropped the bloody paper towel into a biohazard bin and walked towards his office without a word. The entire ER staff watched her go, a silent, supportive gallery. Ben Carter took a half step to follow her to defend her, but an older nurse put a hand on his arm and shook her head. This was something Alara had to face alone. She entered Thorne's office, a space as immaculate and arrogant as the man himself. He slammed the door behind her. "Who in the hell do you think you are?" he hissed, his face inches from hers. That was the most unprofessional, dangerous, and insubordinate display I have ever witnessed. "You put patients at risk with your cowboy antics. You undermined my authority. You are a liability, a loose cannon, and I am going to personally see to it that you never work in a hospital again." Alara stood perfectly still, letting his tirade wash over her. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She just watched him, her quiet stillness a stark contrast to his performative rage. Her silence seemed to infuriate him even more. "I am the chief of this department," he roared, slamming his fist on his expensive mahogany desk. "You answer to me. You are nothing, a clumsy, incompetent, temporary nurse who..." A sharp knock on the office door cut him off. "What?" Thorne shrieked, whirling around. The door opened, and 2 men stepped inside. The first was a hospital administrator in a gray suit, looking nervous. The second man was not. He was tall, ramrod straight in his late 50s, with close-cropped silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He wore the uniform of a full colonel in the United States Army, his chest a formidable constellation of ribbons and medals. He moved with a quiet, absolute confidence that made Thorne's blustering seem childish and pathetic. The atmosphere in the small office shifted instantly. The colonel's eyes scanned the room, bypassing Thorne as if he were invisible, and landed on Alara. A flicker of recognition, of profound respect, softened his hard features for a fraction of a second. "Vance," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. It was not a question. Alara's posture changed subtly. A straightening of the spine, a slight tilt of the head. It was the unconscious acknowledgement of a familiar authority. "Colonel Thorne," she replied, her voice even. Eris Thorne stared, his mouth agape. "Colonel Thorne? Are you related?" he stammered, looking between the two. The colonel's cold eyes finally settled on the doctor, distantly, and with increasing shame, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I'm here to check on 2 of my men, Corporal Davies and Corporal Miller."